Alpha reluctantly decided to escort Fawn to the district which he was assigned, Privy, one of the more recent problem communities, only saved from the fringes because of their high energy output. With heavy rebel influence within, heinous crime was rampant. Local police and risk eaters were tasked with prioritizing protection of the citizens or stopping the forces which sought to dethrone Deicide. To compete with the risk eaters' physical advantage, rebels and criminals often modified certain parts of their anatomy. Even though cybernetic implants were illegal, criminals still found access to the contraband. There existed individuals that were completely cybernetic, except for their brains. They had only been on the streets a few moments before a battle spilled out from a nearby alley. Men covered in dark coats, wielding black spine blades and submachine guns, chased hooded rebels into oncoming traffic. The rebel youths fired handguns at their pursuers. The bullets thudded against their dark coats and fell to the ground. After they had emptied their weapons, they stood there shouting obscenities, while the long-coated personnel checked their watches. A sooty smoke rose from their collars as they spoke to one another. Most of the innocent bystanders had already made their way up the street and into side shops and private residences. The men holding the spine blades put away their submachine guns, and from where she was, Fawn could see the arsenal of weapons one of the men had tucked into the lining of his coat. Spotting grenades, multiple handguns, knives, and even parts of an RPG. They then began to attack the now weaponless rebels, hacking them into wet dog food as the rebels screamed curses at their assailants. Fawn clenched her fist and moved closer to her brother, who was staring at the bedlam with a smirk on his face. A ragged truck full of rebel reinforcement power slid into one of the coated men. The man was thrown several dozen feet into a busy intersection. Seemingly unhurt, he hopped up and returned fire indiscriminately as civilian cars swerved to avoid his bullets. "What the fuck is this? Aren't you going to call this in?" Fawn said, as Alpha pulled her inside a shop. They continued watching from behind the safety of the shatterproof windows. "Nah, see those guys in the coats? Grief givers. They're our allies," Alpha said. "You've got to be shitting me," Fawn said. "They're scum, but they drive everyone back into the arms of the government," Alpha said. Fawn watched as the rebels were turned into fresh stains on the sidewalk. Then the grief givers disappeared into the alleys, just as the risk eater sirens began to blare from a few blocks away. Fawn was sickened by the monstrous parade. The risk eaters arrived, and a few pretended to give chase, while the others called in medics to scrape the luckless rogues off the pavement. She then looked to her brother with a scowl on her face, questioning the stories she had heard of his bravery. "Then what's your job?" Fawn said. "The griefers keep the schmucks in line, the upstarts with a few crumpled bills and a dream. If they survive the violence and extortion on the streets and manage to build something vaguely paramilitary, then we step in," Alpha said. "It's fucked up. I didn't see this on the way in." "Why would you have the puppies guarding the gate?" Fawn said. "No one's a threat until they see the inside of the districts. It's the tanks, planes, and other toys that make us weak, if you can believe it," Alpha said. Fawn thought back to the raid she had witnessed. On a loose leash by a senior instructor, the deathless recruits were free to test their abilities, vaulting through streets, dodging rockets and shells. They looked more like ballet dancers and gymnasts than soldiers. The grief givers were stiff, demonic pariahs compared with the charismatic and lively risk eaters. For the first time since she was a girl, she wanted to meet a noble, to stare him down, and see if he actually believed in the orders his subjects were slaves to. The more she saw of the districts, the more she began to hate Deicide and the poison he had injected into the mind of her brother. The grand speeches he retched up about success and opportunity were not his own words. Alpha was no fool, but those passionate lines about duty and universal law had been written by a professional. She doubted that even the captain had such talent with his words. Once they were back inside the safety of the Olopile, Alpha led Fawn to the risk eater gymnasium. Even after what she had seen of the ship, it still looked like an impossibly large space. There were multi-tiered levels, each filled with teams of personnel all engaging in a range of sports and activities. They were both dressed out in PT gear, the gray and blue of the risk eaters, except Alpha had on his skid underneath. He had explained to Fawn about the many things the suit was capable of, even shown her firsthand that standard small arms ammunition was not enough to puncture the suit. As the siblings began to spar, Fawn noticed baby sister enter with Rodella and a few other men and women she had not met. Alpha waved and they strolled over. The whole time, Fawn and baby sister's eyes were locked on each other. "Why you got your skid on? New talent giving you some trouble?" baby sister said. "Nah, just showing her a few things," Alpha said. "I got a few tricks you can use." "No thanks," Fawn said. Turning away from her, nearly chest to chest with Alpha, he began to whisper to her. "I know you're not one to run from an ass-kicking, but training is going to be rough if you don't earn their respect. They're wearing the captain's tag," Alpha said. Fawn sighed and nodded slowly. Then immediately she spun and landed a kick into baby sister's side. Baby sister caught Fawn's ankle before her foot could do much damage. "Nice. But I'm the queen of dirty around here," baby sister said, throwing Fawn's leg away. The shorter woman curled into a boxing stance, her tiny fists wrapped in white tape. Fawn knew the woman was unable to form a kill box without the filtered vestige material being pumped into her spine, but she was still cautious. She did not want to be knocked out in front of her little brother. Fawn dodged the quick but stubby straights. What baby sister lacked in height was doubled when it came to her speed. An uppercut whizzed by Fawn's chin and grazed her cheek as baby sister launched herself into the air. The crowd that had gathered began to cheer. Everyone knew Fawn had not entered training yet, but no one dared to stop the fight. Senior instructors actually began to take bets on the women. Fawn watched as baby sister slipped her jabs easily. She began to panic as she felt a repeat of the events before were about to happen. She wondered if perhaps the inert vestige material was just a small secret to the Deathless's power. A solid hook snapped Fawn's head to the right, but she remained on her feet, eyes bulging, sucking sterile air into her lungs. Immediately she took hold of baby sister and tried to muscle a takedown, but her force was used against her, and Fawn was spun away. Before she could stand, a biting kick punished her ribs. The second one she caught, and the two women became entangled, wrestling for position, until Fawn was on the shorter woman's back, squeezing her throat. She began to apply an intense pressure to her neck, even as baby sister rammed solid elbows into her gut. Fawn did not let go. The excitement and the pain had her blood up. She could hear her younger brother shouting through the unintelligible screams. Her gums began to bleed and drip through her grimace. She could smell panic radiating from baby sister, not from death, but from a potential embarrassment, which many eaters would argue was much worse. Fawn screamed as her grip began to wear out. Baby sister was shaking, but her muscles seemed to find new vigor. Finally, Fawn could hold on no longer, and baby sister whirled to face Fawn belly to belly. She cocked back her small fist. Fawn reached up and pulled the woman toward her, and bit into baby sister's bicep. She clamped down with as much force as she could, trying to tear away the threaded muscle. Suddenly the crowd was upon them, wrenching them apart. Baby sister screamed as Fawn bit down harder, until finally, ripping away a small portion of skin from her arm. A fury was surrounding Fawn. People were screaming as they pinned her to the deck. Her brother was holding her cheeks and attempting to soothe her mood, but she could not understand anything he was saying. All she could hear was an extraneous voice inside her head, loud but not angry, reaching to her from across a stretch of space impossible to traverse. Even with all the power the infinite universes could supply, it would always remain out of her reach. The voice was grave and female, singing to her a sad epic of the end of all existence. It assured her that all life would eventually end soon. It was up to her to decide how. Would her children, and those born to her children ever after, die without ever knowing the warm kiss of a morning sun? Would they live their entire lives imprisoned in this can, left to fight each other, like starved dogs once the life support could no longer handle the load? A medic shoved his way through the crowd and injected Fawn with a vial of halcyonic cider. As the chemical rushed through her bloodstream, she began to see odd shapes and strange creatures float through the air above. A hard-faced old woman with gold teeth was standing over her. Behind this woman, she could see giant ghost fish swimming through holes in the overhead. Before her eyes was a black dot that bled from a focal point high into the ceiling. As she was jostled all around in the hovering stretcher, it never moved. It seemed unreasonably far away. She reached up out of the stretcher to point at the little dot, only to have her hand swatted back inside by a corpsman. Then she watched as it began to grow larger before her eyes, stretching and spreading itself until it was the only thing she could see. Eventually, she was engulfed in its cold darkness, just barely able to hear the goings-on of the outside world. And yet she was here, in this black nowhere, imprisoned in this strange inner space. The darkness around her was moving. Now that she was aware of its organic quality, the entity surrounding her was ancient, mistrustful of her youthful presence. At first she wondered if this presence was God. She smirked as she tossed the thought aside, finally determining that she had died and this was all there was to report, should she ever awaken from this nightmare. This Deicide was bound to be disappointed, she thought. Then she could feel this entity was protecting something. An egg, perhaps, or maybe a child. She reached out once more and was met with enormous, oily yellow eyes. They contracted to long and slender lines, glaring at her with malice and suspicion. Even in what Fawn thought was the end of her existence, she was defiant. Even as the gigantic eyes saw into her being, she could feel the black tendrils covering her legs and breasts. The creature heaved in laughter at her suffering and shame. Slowly her nails began to pull away from her fingers and toes. Black needles punctured her skin and muscle. Tendrils attached themselves at all of her joints. Then Fawn grit her teeth as she prepared to be torn into several pieces by the brutal force she could feel welling up inside this creature. A muffled moan escaped from her belly and out through her cracked lips. From her own mind sprung chaotic laughter, mocking her with biting insults. Well, if this is the end, she thought, then at least I was right.